Peter had a question for Jesus today that I think gets at the heart of one of our central Christian principles and practices. Peter asked Jesus, "How often should I forgive?" And I think we can all relate to that question, because there's probably somebody that we can think of in a matter of minutes that we wonder, how often should we forgive that person? Or maybe we could think of a particular person who we think maybe they don't deserve that much forgiveness, right? And so I think in trying to be a good student, Peter attempted to answer his own question. How often should I forgive, Jesus? 7 times? 7 times. I mean, that's pretty generous. I mean, it's not often that people get second chances in this life, much less 7. But shockingly, here's how Jesus responds to what Peter probably thinks is a really generous forgiveness ledger. Jesus says, no, not 7, 77 times. And now Jesus doesn't mean that's the literal ledger. He says 77 to make a point, as if saying, okay, Peter, think of a number that you would be very generous in terms of forgiveness. Okay, now take that number and multiply it by 11. Jesus is an extremist. He's an extremist for mercy. And then to expand on his point, Jesus then tells a parable about a slave who owes a king an enormous amount of money, and how the king goes back and forth on what he should do with this slave who owes him this impossible amount of money, who couldn't pay him back. And eventually, the king took pity on the slave and forgave the monetary debt entirely. And here's what happened next in the parable. The recently forgiven slave then goes off and confronts someone who owed him money. And when it was his turn to forgive debts, he instead violently demands what he is owed. And the king found out about this slave's unwillingness to forgive and threw him into a prison to be tortured. And there ends the parable. The lesson? I'm sure there's multiple interpretations, but here's a lesson. Like the king, God has forgiven us unconditionally. And likewise, we are now expected to forgive others. And there are consequences if we do not. That's it. God forgives. Now we need to forgive. End of sermon, right? Not really. Don't we all wish forgiveness was that easy? The church talks often about the command to forgive, but we don't often name how difficult and complicated the practice and process of forgiveness is. For starters, the breakdown of our human relationships is usually more complicated than Jesus' parable. Some of us hold deep and dark and vicious pasts where people have wronged us in profoundly damaging ways. Some of the wrongdoings against us still linger, and we cannot simply erase the pain like one could a monetary debt. Whether it was last night or last week or years ago, people, family, friends, fellow church members, strangers have hurt us deeply. Some of us we've been cheated on, or some of us we've watched our friends or our family be cheated on. Some of us we've had our children hurt by others. Some of us have been betrayed by friends or spouses. Some of us have been abused emotionally or physically. Some of us have been backstabbed by business partners or colleagues. we aren't simply owed money. We have deep wounds. And with some of those wounds, some of us are concentrating on working through the pain that's still lingering. And the thought of forgiveness is a far-off concept. Because many of us are still carrying heavy, heavy agony. And therefore, forgiving someone who hurt us isn't as simple as resetting the debt to zero. So perhaps forgiveness for you and those who have hurt you cannot simply play out like canceling a debt. So I want to offer other metaphors that might speak more relevantly to your experiences, because at the end of the day, the call of this parable remains the same. No matter which metaphor you identify with, the call of the parable is, you have been forgiven, now forgive one another. So with forgiveness and pain being so complicated, perhaps this is a more suitable metaphor for you. Maybe it would be helpful to think of the process of forgiveness as a decision to no longer pick the scab. It is not so much an erasure of debt owed as it is a commitment to letting a wound heal, to let go from picking at it. Scars might remain forever, but healing can happen if forgiveness looks like leaving the scab alone. Or if that metaphor doesn't work, maybe some of us need to think of forgiveness as the process of moving out of a dilapidated house. We may always have the painful memories of that old house, of the hurt and the pain that people have caused. But an attitude of forgiveness is choosing to begin the process of no longer living there, of no longer living in the frames of resentment, pain, and vengeance. And it may take a long time to move out, piece by piece, but the lesson of the parable is clear. Forgiveness needs to be our new residence. Or if that metaphor doesn't work, perhaps welding a broken piece of metal is the metaphor for forgiveness that's more relevant. Welding is a process. And when you weld two broken pieces of metal, the bond never looks the same. But after hard work, patience, and the right tools, the bond can be remade. So maybe the metaphor for forgiveness that speaks to you is not a mere canceling of debts, but a commitment to the process of melting broken edges in our relationships, restoring bonds and coming back together, even if in a different way. The parable's lesson is either way clear. We must begin the welding. And now, returning to Jesus' parable, there is something really powerful that I want to lift up. The slave in that parable owed the king an impossible amount of money. How impossible? He owed 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents. That is the equivalent, my friends, to 200,000 years worth of wages. 200,000 years worth of wages. The slave could have never paid that back. And here's why that detail matters. Just like the slave could never, ever pay that debt, there are people who have hurt us, that have hurt you and I, who cannot change the past. Whatever they owe us, they cannot pay it. It might as well be 200,000 years worth of wages, because that's how impossible it is to change the past. And as one scholar puts it, part of the process of forgiveness is letting go of the hope that the past can be changed. Again, because to change the past is as impossible as paying back 200,000 years worth of wages. And according to Jesus, there's only one thing which can set us free and move us forward, and that is forgiveness. And if we don't lean into the process of forgiving one another, Jesus is very clear in this parable about the consequences of a life defined by grudges and unreconciled relationships. It will be a living hell. The unwillingness to forgive catches up to the slave at the end of the parable, and his existence is tortured. A life of grudge and unhealed relationships, a life of resentment, is that not torture? Our unwillingness to forgive can foster some pretty gruesome realities and cycles beyond ourselves living in a living hell. How many wars have been fought? How many brawls have broken out? How many shots have been fired? How many relationships died? How many friendships destroyed, communities fractured, and families torn apart because forgiveness never interrupted the cycles of pain and vengeance? As my favorite author, Kurt Vonnegut, has penned, revenge provokes revenge, which provokes revenge, which provokes revenge, forming an unbroken chain of death and destruction, linking nations of today to barbarous tribes of thousands and thousands of years ago. And as a theologian, Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it, it is forgiveness is what can finally break that chain and those cycles of revenge and resentment and pain. And importantly, she emphasizes that the call to forgiveness, to forgiving people that hurt you and me, is not the call to being a doormat. Forgiveness is not being okay with what happened. Forgiveness is not silence. Rather, here's what the theologian Nadia says. When someone else does us harm, we are connected to that mistreatment like a chain. And what if forgiveness, rather than being a pansy way of saying it's okay, is actually a way of wielding bolt cutters to that chain and snapping the chain that links us? Forgiveness can be a way of saying, what you did to me is so not okay that I refuse to be connected to it anymore. So forgiveness is about being a freedom fighter. End quote. So sisters and brothers, forgiving others is a power move. It's a freedom move. And Jesus commands it for the well-being of the world and for our well-being. Forgiving others is a refusal to be imprisoned by resentment and the pain that people have caused. Forgiving others is about you having authority and freedom from what people have done to you. The warning in this parable is that an unwillingness to forgive equals imprisonment, an enslavement to cycles of resentment and revenge obligations. And Jesus reminds us over and over and over again from these parables to the very cross on which he died, that it is mercy, that is the only thing powerful enough to interrupt these destructive cycles. My friends, that is what Christ did for us. And following in that example can be world-changing. It can be freeing, it can be empowering, and it can be healing. So yeah, not 7 times, 77 times. Amen.